With every story I tell, there are some folks who find themselves asking the question, why? Why do I need to hear this tale? What use is there in hearing about a blade or a bite or a burn? And to those folks, I say, have you looked outside lately? By trade, he was a scribe for the local parish, carrying his gospel through the valleys. And in the dark corners of Europe, whispers grew of a man who had carved away his sin with a blade and touched, if only for a moment, something terrifyingly divine. A man of ink-stained fingers and eyes that twitched like moths around candlelight. And if you want to send me questions, comments or suggestions, you can find me on social media. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. He copied scripture by hand, letter by sacred letter, and somewhere between the Psalms and the book of Job, something inside him began to snap. No one noticed it at first. He was always quiet, always fasting, always muttering lines of St. Augustine or flagellating himself behind the vestry. But by the winter of 1763, villagers began whispering. Elias had taken to sleeping in the ossuary beneath the chapel, where the bones of plague victims lay like forgotten rosaries. He said their silence helped him listen. Listen, he claimed, to God. His sermons, though unauthorized, grew fevered. He spoke not of salvation, but of severance. To know the divine, he would rasp, we must peel away the animal. He believed that sin did not live in the heart, but in the groin, the gut, the sweat-soaked shadow of human desire. He accused the other priests of heresy, of worshipping comfort disguised as holiness. He fasted until his skin bruised beneath the touch of air, and then, one night, he disappeared. They found him 3 days later, half frozen in a barn, naked from the waist down, clutching a rusted scythe. He had cut off his own genitals and offered them to the Virgin, arranging them on a torn linen cloth beside a vial of his blood and a note. In his crooked script, he had written, "Let this be my tithe." Remarkably, he survived. Fevered, pale and swollen with infection, he lingered at the edge of death for weeks. The bishop, horrified, demanded his silence. But when Elias recovered, he refused to retreat. Instead, he began writing. Dozens of pages poured from him, visions, dreams, diagrams of spiritual anatomy. He described a second body, hidden within the mortal shell, a structure of light and pain, which only revealed itself when the desires of the flesh had been amputated. He saw himself as a gatekeeper, a martyr of purity. Others began to gather around him, farmhands, widowers, even a midwife who claimed she had seen the face of Christ in the steam of boiled cloth. They called themselves the Ascenti. They lived in filth but claimed they were rising. Some took vows of silence. Others refused food touched by fire. One man sealed his own lips with wax and wrote only in ash. And Elias, gaunt and wrapped in grey linens, began teaching from a makeshift pulpit carved from gravestones. He wore no shoes. His breath smelled of roots and iron. He spoke of a kingdom not in heaven, but beyond skin, where form no longer mattered. Have you felt the sun on your skin or smelled the grass after rain or heard the cry of a lonely bird in the twilight? You think the world's too dark already? Too painful? Then close your eyes and imagine what it must be like to exist in a world without senses, without feelings, without the blessed torment of being alive. This is a tale for those who've ever asked, why? For if we cannot feel pain, then we cannot know joy. If we cannot know darkness, then we cannot see the light. In the withering dusk of 18th century Prussia, in a town where the streets stank of wax and rotting wheat, lived a man named Elias Vogel. The church, of course, denounced him. The local magistrate ordered his writings burned. But the Ascenti scattered like seeds. If you want to hear more dark and disturbing tales from history, stay tuned. The problem with stories about serial killers is that they're usually true. So, when asked to summarize this horror story, I told my writer friend that it was inspired by real people. Here's what happened next. By the spring of 1765, the name Elias Vogel was no longer uttered in sermons but in nightmares. His followers, the Ascenti, had grown bolder. They traveled from village to village wrapped in burlap robes. Tracing the Ascenti's path like a map of plague, he became obsessed, claiming in a lecture that Elias was not mad, but correct that beneath the madness lay a terrifying truth we've dressed in metaphor. Weeks later, Halbert vanished. His home was found empty, but there are men who hear voices and see demons. You can find more like it in our anthology of weird horror stories. Just search for our podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next week. Who feel compelled to cut out their own balls and fly through the air with wings made of ribs? And there's nothing, absolutely nothing, we can do about it, save for a scorched manuscript and a small wooden box containing, unmistakably, a pair of withered testicles wrapped in prayer cloth, and still, no one knew where Elias had gone. Some said he had died, among his flock, buried in unmarked soil beneath a church that now refused visitors. Others claimed he had never been human to begin with, that he had been a messenger, a parasite in flesh, sent to remind mankind of its bargain with the divine. But in hushed corners of Central Europe, old families still keep candles lit in underground rooms, not in worship, not in fear, in remembrance, for what he revealed could not be undone. Chanting in tongues older than Latin, eyes sunken from fasting. They have certain brain abnormalities or toxic parents or whatever. Some of these men showed no signs of mental illness, psychosis, or sociopathy. They just went around killing people. After they finished, they felt no remorse, no sadness, no regret. They were kind of proud of themselves. They felt like they'd done something good. This isn't just a British phenomenon. Serial killers in Russia, Canada, China, and the US all gave similar answers for why they kill and how they can't control themselves. Well, here's a fun fact for your Friday. Researchers in the UK recently interviewed 25 self-confessed serial killers. Almost all of them said they had no choice in becoming a serial killer. They were destined for it. It chose them. And as for why, they gave reasons that sounded eerily familiar to those given by the two Dominicans sent to stop Elias Vogel's cult. They were protecting the innocent. They were acting on behalf of a higher power. They were doing God's work. They were eliminating deviants. They were correcting imbalances. One even said, "My victims were better off dead. It was a mercy killing." How do you argue with that? I don't know. I didn't ask him. In a small town near Görlitz, a blacksmith's wife slit her own abdomen in imitation of Elias, claiming she was releasing the garden of flesh. She died within minutes, cradled by women who wept and called it birth. The church could no longer ignore them. Two Dominican brothers were sent to infiltrate the group. One vanished entirely. The other returned weeks later, raving about fire falling from mouths and a scroll of human skin passed hand to hand. During secret rites, he died in his cell, clawing at his own throat. But while the Ascenti spread like fungus beneath damp stone, Elias remained in hiding. Also, it seemed, in truth, he had retreated to an abandoned nunnery deep in the Thuringian forest, where moss-consumed scripture carved in stone and ravens made their nests in broken confessionals. There, in a room lit only by smoke and beeswax, he dictated what would become his final manuscript, Corpus Eternum, the eternal body. The pages were dense, raving, yet disturbingly precise. He described not just visions, but a system, a ladder of purification, each rung demanding greater violence upon the self. Hunger, silence, isolation, mutilation, and finally, unbecoming, a term he never defined, only hinted at through drawings, spirals carved into flesh, faces split open in worship, and figures hovering above their own bodies, stitched together by ropes of blood. One page showed Elias himself, eyes hollow, mouth sewn shut, with wings sprouting not from his back, but his open rib cage. And then, as abruptly as it had risen, the movement seemed to rot. Reports came of entire Ascenti circles found dead in candlelit barns, their bodies arranged in geometric patterns, fingers missing, symbols burned into their chests. One girl, barely 12, was discovered wandering alone in a field, her eyes scraped out and stitched with horsehair. She claimed Elias had climbed into the sky. The authorities dismissed her as mad, but others did not. In Prague, a professor of comparative theology named Lucian Halbert began collecting the remnants of Elias's writings I'm pretty sure most people think serial killers are born, not made. And here's another thing. So my takeaway for today is this: free will is overrated. We like to think we're all in control. Now, if you enjoyed this story, it is difficult to overstate how little we know about the man they called Elias Vogel. By all accounts, he was a brilliant linguist, an unparalleled polymath, and a healer, too. Some said he could cure sickness with a touch, though many more whispered he cured people of devils. And as the world barrels forward in glittering technology, synthetic pleasure, digital immortality maybe, that ancient voice still waits in the marrow of our bones, whispering, "Hollow yourself, hollow and be filled." So ask yourself, as you scroll past this video, sip your tea, adjust the light, what part of you is still keeping you from heaven? Then there were his followers, the body snatchers of Hanover, the children who spoke in tongues, the ecstatic dancers of Nuremberg. There was even talk of a vast network, an esoteric order reaching back to Prague, forward to Paris, all linked by blood and bone and the rituals performed on nights when the veil between worlds grew thin. It sounded like heresy, blasphemous nonsense, but the records tell a different tale. Years passed, and the name Elias Vogel was left to wither among footnotes and fire. His writings were banned, his followers buried or forgotten, their bodies burned in lime pits alongside witches and madmen. But silence, history teaches us, is rarely a grave, it is a vault, and inside it, things ferment. In 1842, nearly a century after Elias vanished, a traveling physician named Dr. Albrecht Woad was summoned to a remote village nestled in the Carpathians. An outbreak of religious seizures, the letter claimed children speaking dead languages, men convulsing at the sight of mirrors. But what Woad found was worse. The villagers had discovered a sealed chamber beneath the ruins of a monastery bricked over, lost to memory. Inside were 16 bodies, perfectly preserved in seated positions, facing a wall edged with spirals and scrawled prayers. Among them, in the center, sat a figure wrapped in rotting grey linen, a rusted blade across his lap, the bones of his pelvis surgically absent. Around his neck hung a small silver plaque, blackened by age but just legible. It read, "EV, I made myself hollow." Dr. Woad's notes, though partially censored by the university in Dresden, mentioned that the corpse's skull was unnaturally thin, almost translucent. Under lantern light, he claimed it glowed. He sent samples to Berlin, but they were lost in a fire 2 weeks later. Shortly after, Woad was declared insane, institutionalized, and died muttering fragments of Latin that made no grammatical sense, but reportedly caused the priests to faint during a reading. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. In the 1930s, German occult researchers operating in secret beneath the SS on Enneberry opened interest in Vogel. They believed he had achieved a form of biological transcendence and attempted to replicate his rites in abandoned churches. Entire villages were cleared under the guise of military drills. To this day, those valleys remain empty, marked only by brittle statues with no eyes. And then came the Cold War. Soviet psychiatrists, desperate to break the will of dissidents, referenced Vogel's methods, his use of hunger, silence, dismemberment as a template for mental reconditioning. In a declassified KGB memo, a colonel writes, "Evie had the correct instinct. To control the soul, one must conquer the flesh. Begin from the groin." But what if now, in 2011, a hiker in Saxony fell through a sinkhole and uncovered a crypt? Inside was a circle of candles, still unburned, and a leather-bound book whose title read only, "The Final Shedding." Authorities claimed it was a hoax. The hiker has since refused interviews, and yet, copies of Elias's writings still appear in auctions, handwritten in red ink on lambskin. Collectors pass them like cursed relics. Some disappear, others suffer. One prominent scholar, after reading Corpus Eternum aloud to a class, was found in his study days late nude, eyes missing, a phrase carved into his chest with a fountain pen. "I am closer now." They say belief dies in the light of reason, but belief, like rot, prefers the dark. Elias Vogel was not the first to mutilate himself for God, nor the last, but perhaps he was the only one who believed it worked.